làm rất là nhiều nghề, nhất là lúc mới định cư, chân ướt chân ráo mới đến, còn trở ngại rất nhiều về ngôn ngữ, thì tôi làm tất cả những cái nghề mà lao động để mà kiếm tiền, vừa làm part time vừa đi học. Thì trong đó có rửa chén, chạy bàn, giữ em, giữ người già, làm hãng may, tất cả những cái việc lao động mà không có cần ngôn ngữ.
So I actually grew up in a small business, actually a few small businesses. My mom was really the entrepreneur in our family. Both my parents worked in laborious jobs when we first immigrated to the States. And eventually it just became really challenging. And hearing the success stories of other small businesses, that my mom was like, okay, I know I can cook really well and I love people. So I think that really pushed her to be a true entrepreneur.
So growing up, I was helping my family out with the newspaper. I still remember back then, that's when they would have these big sheets of laminate, and you would cut out sheets of paper and you would use wax and roll it on, and then they would photograph it. And so the newspaper was a really important part of my life. We would go to a lot of Vietnamese American events, the festivals. Visiting our clients was also something that was really important to my parents, that we would always show up for our advertisers. But I didn't speak Vietnamese, and I actually didn't speak Vietnamese until after college.
Rồi sau đó tiếng Anh hơi khá thì bắt đầu vô trường college học xong rồi thì qua trường đại học. Thì tôi thực sự mà nói tôi rất là may mắn trong cái vấn đề nghề nghiệp. Mặc dầu mới có bằng cấp đầu tiên, nhưng mà chủ của tôi hồi xưa tôi làm đó là đầu tiên là tôi làm cho cái hãng non-profit, nhưng mà họ là gọi là King County Sàigòn Resort Center, đó là tiếng Anh, tức là cái công ty mà giúp đỡ cho những người bị xúc phạm, trẻ em bị xâm phạm này kia đó. Họ rất là khuyến khích, tại vì thật sự cái thời gian đó thì cán sự xã hội Việt Nam thì rất ít, cho nên tôi cảm thấy rất là may mắn là có những người chủ rất là nâng đỡ mình, giúp đỡ cho mình để mà tiến cao hơn trong cái công việc nghề nghiệp.
I started with the idea that I could pursue science or medicine. Terrible, really terrible idea, because I had no passion there and I'm really bad at math. But I tried anyways, because I was always a very studious student. And then I started to take more social science classes. It came to me and I understood the concepts a lot more. I had a focus on Asian American studies. So that really helped me actually connect my own personal journey, why I was here, why I experienced certain things. It really made me think, oh, like it makes sense. It's not just me, but there's a whole community that is experiencing these things.
Theo nhận biết cá nhân của tôi thì trong cái thời gian tôi làm việc mấy chục năm thì thường thì người ta có một cái suy nghĩ thế này. Tị nạn Việt Nam có từng đợt, thí dụ như nói về đợt tị nạn năm 75 thì ai cũng cho rằng đây là nhóm người đi trước, nhóm người trí thức này kia nọ, rồi nhóm người đi sau là kế tiếp là nhóm người thiền nhân, rồi kế tiếp rồi con lai, rồi kế tiếp là HO. Có rất nhiều diện tị nạn qua đây thì người ta thường chia ra từng nhóm. Nhưng mà theo cái sự làm việc trong xã hội của tôi đó, thì tôi thấy đó là chỉ lời đồn thôi, nhưng mà trên thực tế thì tất cả những người tị nạn khi đến đất nước mới lúc nào cũng có nhiều trở ngại, mà cái trở ngại mà nó gần giống nhau là ngôn ngữ, là ai cũng phải học Anh ngữ.
So I was born in Vietnam, came here around 2. There's a lot of in between. We were at a refugee camp and all those things. Came here and we lived with our sponsor family for a period of time. Although I was born in Vietnam, I pretty much grew up and lived my life as an American kid.
So I grew up in the 1980s, 1990s, and that was a time of assimilation. I still remember when I got registered for school. At the time, I spoke Vietnamese up till I was age 5, and my parents said, okay, you're going to need to have an American name now. What about the name Julie? And Julie is, it's a French name, and my parents had studied French in Vietnam. And so my Vietnamese name is Hoài Hương. At that point, I pretty much stopped speaking Vietnamese. My parents worked all the time, and so it's not like they had time to preserve the culture. And being a latchkey kid, I just didn't see my parents that much. It was pretty normal. I think now when I compare later generations, there's so much more emphasis on keeping and preserving the language, and when I was growing up, that wasn't the case. I don't resent that though. I think a lot of people ask me, oh, don't you wish your parents had taught you Vietnamese? And it's just, my parents were really busy. They were working all the time. And that's what a lot of kids my age, my generation experienced.
Ngay trong gia đình, tôi thường nói chuyện với phụ huynh đó. Chúng tôi chỉ có một tuần lễ có 2 tiếng đồng hồ gần gũi các em. Cả ngày các em nó gần gũi các thầy cô người bản xứ, tức là tiếng Anh rồi. Rồi phụ huynh thì cố gắng nói chuyện tiếng Việt và giao tiếp với các em bằng tiếng Việt thì các em dễ thành công. Thì tôi nghĩ rằng tất cả những người Việt ở đây sau gần 50 năm rồi thì chắc chắn là các quý vị thấy cái sự quan trọng của tiếng Việt là giữ gìn văn hóa Việt Nam nó tốt đẹp như thế nào. Đó là cái lời mà cô nghĩ rằng cô vẫn hy vọng là tất cả những gia đình Việt Nam ở Seattle nói riêng và trên toàn nước Mỹ, cả ở thế giới cũng vậy. Chính cha mẹ là thầy cô giáo chứ không phải cứ dựa vào chúng tôi. Chúng tôi chỉ đưa ra cái đường lối hướng dẫn, còn người thực hành là chính quý vị. Và chính vì cái văn hóa Việt Nam thì con mình nó mới biết cái cội nguồn mình, thì nó mới yêu được đất nước Việt Nam, nó mới có một cái trái tim Việt Nam.
Back in 2019 was the first time I got to really experience my queerness while visiting Vietnam. And that was like the first time I was outwardly, I guess, living my life as like a queer and trans Vietnamese person. And to my surprise, it was actually pretty anticlimactic. I was pretty scared prior to the trip because I thought that, it was going to be like really hard to tell my family back in Vietnam that I was trans and that I'm living my life as, Oliver V now and not my, my dead name. I remember it being a lot easier than the desert where I grew up. Like, I kind of just walked around as myself, and I think because Vietnamese masculinity is a lot less, rigid in a different way from like American masculinity or like Western masculinity. I like to document just like my life and like the people that I'm connected to, my community that is within like the queer and trans community. I feel like it's pretty important, especially nowadays with the climate. A lot of like queer and trans narratives aren't always authentically documented. At least it's not coming from like our voices. So some of the ways that I feel like my art comes out a lot is preserve like everyday rituals, everyday just existing through the communities and my chosen family.
I fell in love with history from my very first history class. And then I started to learn about the Vietnam War. And in the Vietnam War, it was very much about the Vietnamese and the Americans. And so I asked my dad about that. I was like, so this is what I'm learning in school. And so my dad started telling me about, there's the South Vietnamese perspective. And that's when I realized, there's this American perspective and Vietnamese perspective, and yet that Vietnamese perspective is de facto the North Vietnamese, the communist perspective. That's how Americans tell the story. And that the South Vietnamese perspective has totally been written out. And so I started to get interested in that in college. And so as a sophomore, I did my first research paper by interviewing my dad's friends who were South Vietnamese veterans. My father had also served in the Navy as well. And that became a much bigger thesis. I ended up interviewing 40 South Vietnamese veterans, and I just got really interested in that work.
thì cái năm 1994 á, thì rất là nhiều trở ngại, bởi vì các quý vị đã quen dùng những cái từ, các em quen dùng những từ Việt Nam. Nhưng mà may mắn có một số các anh em giáo viên kỳ cựu á, thì họ đã học cũng giống như cô, thì họ biết phân biệt cái nào là từ mới mà nó hay thì mình bắt chước, nó không hay thì mình không bắt chước. Đó là những cái từ mà cái ngôn ngữ bây giờ các em nó không biết, nó lớn lên nó vậy, nó cứ dùng thì mình sửa nó dần dần. Thế còn đối với những người lớn mà lỡ mà miệng nói ra, rồi cứ nói là từ ngày giải phóng thì bên này quật lại ai giải phóng ai, từ ngày mình gọi là mất nước, mình đi lưu vong thì đúng hơn, đại khái như vậy, thì cũng phải sửa từng từ thôi.
So the way that the Friends of Little Saigon navigates conflict and conflicting ideals and challenges in the community is that I see ourselves as conveners. We're very good at listening, and I think everyone wants to be heard. And so we kind of play that role, even though we potentially don't agree with certain opinions. I think it's still valid to hear them out and to acknowledge that we do have different opinions and different experiences. And so I think as kind of the younger folks in the Vietnamese community, the Friends of Little Saigon has kind of come up to this place where we came in really trying to understand and listen and bring people together. And that is at the core of our work. But I know as we grow and get larger, we also are being faced with, okay, what point do we kind of stop listening and we have to act on certain opinions or certain objectives that may be conflicting within the community. I think we're facing some of those challenges now, and our organization has really just great people, and at the core of it, we try to do things that emulate shared values across our community. And a lot of those values lie in just celebrating our culture and our identity and just the journey that the community has been on.
I don't know if it's headed this way, but like, you know, this is where I hope it goes. Like, I do feel like the Vietnamese American community has a pretty long road to be a lot more inclusive to queer and trans Vietnamese folks, and specifically queer and trans women, because there's like barely any representation, and they are the most marginalized. So I feel like in those ways, like I wish and I pray that we move towards a future where voices of like trans Vietnamese women, how they want the world to be, is more taken into accountability. Because I feel like there is none of that, to be honest.
My hopes and dreams are to kind of unfold the layers of this neighborhood. It's not this one-dimensional or like kind of stereotype of what it means to be Vietnamese, but that Little Saigon in particular as a geographically based place that has all this heritage and culture, and you start to question, do I actually know this neighborhood? Like, what is Little Saigon? And I think this mural was our small chance to do that, is to illustrate the beauty of Vietnam and the Vietnamese culture, but also the history of the Japanese American community that was here, the culture around jazz and the Black community that was here, creating a lot more layers to this neighborhood.
Văn hóa là gì? Văn hóa là những cái gì mà nó còn lại trong con người, cái gì tốt đẹp còn lại, cái đó mới là văn hóa. Còn cái gì nó xấu thì tự động nó sẽ sa thải. Nếu mà các em tạo được cho các bé nó sinh trưởng ở Mỹ, nó là người Việt Nam, thì phải tạo cho nó một cái trái tim Việt Nam, thì lúc đó nó mới yêu được quê hương mình.
It's gonna take time for like older generations or like the generations now to like be more inclusive about it, because it's only been what, we're about to, you know, have our 50th anniversary of the end of the war, so like that's only 5 decades. You know, it's hard to make that type of, or like put the intention into queer and trans politics after going through such, a traumatizing time. So like, I do understand it's gonna take time.
When I think about the future of the Vietnamese community, I see so much strength because there's so much unity, there's so much pride in our heritage. And it's important to remember that we can belong to multiple communities, cultures, and identities at the same time. That we are Vietnamese, that we are Americans, we are Seattleites, we are whatever generation that we happen to belong to. And to also think about that we are in this for a long time, that whatever feels so urgent right now actually isn't that urgent. It doesn't need to be answered right now, because sometimes truth takes time to evolve, and our answers and what we believe to be true changes over time. And so not to hold so tightly to what we think has to happen right now.